Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Michael started with loss very early in his life when his mother got killed in a car accident, leaving behind two boys and their father. Michael was 8 weeks old at the time and magically recovered after having almost all the bones in his tiny body broken. It took Michael a big part of his life to figure out how to deal with grief, depression and suicidal thoughts, at the same time creating a legacy by offering programs to create awareness in young people about drinking and driving. Michael shares how working with a therapist helped him look at the ways in which he had modeled avoiding his feelings of grief and what tools supported him in overcoming his suicidal thoughts. Michael says,
she hit me pretty hard with the very first day. When I was going in there thinking I'm going to talk about my aunt and my father's death, her first question was, hey, let's talk about your mother's death and how that impacted all your relationships. And I was stunned. I was like, well, there's a knockout punch. I don't want to talk about that. Even at age 47, I still didn't want to really talk about that in depth. But she was right. I had to.
About this week's guest. Michael Gershe is a survivor of a drunk driving car crash that killed his mother and nearly himself when he was 8 weeks old. Despite breaking almost all the bones in the crash, he went on to become a collegiate swimmer, comedian, speaker, author, college educator and photographer. With over 25 years of experience on stage, Michael has presented his programs at schools, colleges, military bases, courts and even a TEDx talk. He uses humor, audience participation and his story for an educational and inspirational message. In 2015, he founded the Magic of Life Foundation, a non-profit organization that helps his mission in eliminating impaired driving, making communities safer and empowering people to make better choices in life. In 2019, he published his memoir, The Magic of Life, a son's story after tragedies, grief, and a Speedo. Please check out his website, The Magic of Life. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for taking time for the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Listeners know already from season 1, this is the podcast talking about how people deal with grief and trauma. And for this season, I really looked out for men to share about their grief and their trauma and how it influenced their life. So I'm really excited that you gave me the time to talk to me. So why don't we start with you telling us and the listener a little bit about how loss and trauma has shaped your life?
Sure. I started young. On September 19th, 1970, my family and I were hit by a drunk driver, and I was 8 weeks old at that point in time. And the drunk driver T-boned our car, and the force of the impact was so great, it pushed our car into a telephone pole. And when the first responders arrived, they found my father, they found my brother, they found my mother. They didn't find me in the car until 10, 15 minutes later. And I was sandwiched between the door and the dash of the car. The four of us were taken to the same hospital. My mom was taken into surgery. And as for me, every bone in my body was nearly broken. My skull was completely fractured from one side of my head to the other. So the fact that I am speaking to you today is nothing short of a miracle. And I'm happy to be here in order to do that. Unfortunately, my mother, who was 28, died the next morning due to her injuries. So I'm a mother's child who never knew his mom because of a drunk driver. I'm 52 years old. And the word mom, mother, isn't in my own vocabulary. The word mom has no emotional attached to it. So that really started my journey with grief and trauma, even though even as a kid, growing up, how to cope with it, how to deal with it, all those type of things. And, how do you mourn someone you never really met, at 8 weeks old. But also through my life, losing my grandparents, my grandmother when I was 8, my grandfather when I was 24, one of my best friends in 2004, who, even though he knew my story as a drunk, being involved in a drunk driving crash, he was the drunk driver and he died in a one-car crash. And he lost his life at age 33. And then in 2018, I lost my dad in January of 2018, and then I lost my aunt 90 days later. So all that grief and all those things came to a head pretty much in 2018. But I always mourned and grieved my mother's death my entire life, and all those what ifs, what if my mom was alive and those type of things, and the anger and the sadness. And it's just one of those things of starting young. And back in 1970, even the 80s, there wasn't any mental health push like there is now towards grief and trauma. So
Yeah.
you really had to navigate it on my own. And despite all my injuries, in that crash, I grew up to be a competitive swimmer, and so I swam. That helped, and luckily, I was blessed with a sense of humor. Being a comedian, and hearing laughter definitely helps with trauma and grief, and I'm very immature for my age, so I think that helps too. But it's also hard being a comedian, and because you go, the one laugh I never heard was my mom's. You think about those type of things, and but yeah, it started at 8 weeks old down that path of grief and trauma.
Wow. I mean, you just gave us a little summary within the last 5 to 8 minutes of your life, and obviously sort of collected all those different losses and traumas. Now, the question for me, having an 11-year-old now myself, how do you grow up without mother being part of your vocabulary? I mean, seeing all these other kids with a mother. How was that?
Yeah, being a kid, we were so busy swimming. I don't think we had time to really think about that. And I grew up with a mother figure. Her name is Dolly. She's Jamaican, so I have a white Jewish family and a black Jamaican family in a way. And she was hired part time around October, November after the car crash. And what was supposed to be a part-time job turned into a lifetime. So you take a
Wow.
horrible situation, and here is a woman that stepped into that motherhood role, but we still called her Dolly. We didn't call her mom or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, growing up in that dynamic was still a little bit different. And you're different because you hear, a black woman, raising, two white boys, in a white Jewish household. But didn't really dawn on me about that as a kid because you're too busy being a kid. I was swimming, going to school, playing with Star Wars, pretending to be Spider-Man. My creativity and my imagination, I think, was a great escape from that. Um, and not really dwelling on it so much until you get older because you really can't process it so much.
Yeah.
You're different, but how do you navigate? And with my father being, a male of the 50s, 60s, 40s earlier, and being in the military, it's 1970. There's no one's going to tell him to go to counseling, and he hid it. I mean, it was all buried deep inside, and you see that. So you role model those behaviors later on in life too about how to deal with grief. But we were so busy being kids. I don't really recall that much thinking about it until I got a little bit older, maybe high school age, college age, because I was just trying to, you know, um, be a kid and get through the next day, whether it's school or some practice or whatever it was.
What's your earliest recollection of thinking, why do I not have a mother and everyone else has a mother? I mean, that must have become obvious before high school.
Yeah, it was probably right. It was early because I remember school forms, dad's name, Martin Gershe, mom's name, deceased. So we're talking elementary school
Yeah.
when you know how different it is when you have those forms and hey, there's a family of everyone's white in that family, right? And then here's Dolly. So you're different, from there. So it was early on as a kid,
Because I remember
probably
my
3, 4.
yeah my daughter, when she went to fourth grade, they had a topic of family, so they had to draw a family tree. And then the question comes, okay, well, who's part of your family? And then she includes her sister, her twin sister. And then the other kids would say, well, you don't have a sister because she's not here. But then
Right.
she has a sister. And for her, this is part. I mean, for her, even the other two miscarriages that I have count as her siblings because she would love to have a sibling. So she just counts
Right.
them all. But that's, that topic comes up as to, well, where's your mother? And so you have to obviously deal with that. How did you deal with being semi-orphaned so early on in life?
Escapism, pretending to be other people, I guess was one way. And I think it wasn't until high school, no, probably high school when I decided, okay, um, I want to make a difference and try to prevent other people from going through what I went through. So I went on that path to, how can I share my story to save other lives? But
So that was in high
college,
school already.
yeah, but I think it was really college. Yeah, it was. I was like, well, I found out it was drunk driving when I was high school. I don't recall ever knowing it was drunk driving until then. I had to
Okay.
go back to my dad's room to get his wallet, and next to his wallet was the press release of the crash.
Okay.
And then I got involved here in the States back in the 80s with something called SAD, Students Against Drunk Driving. So I got involved with that, and that kind of led me on to the path of being a speaker to talk, share my story. Um, but college, I think, was a really pivotal time that I could really recall because growing up, being a kid, you think about it, but not so much. But college, I left Miami, Florida for Ohio. I swam angry. I wasn't an angry person, but I was angry at God, angry at my father for never talking about my mom so much, willingly, and then angry at Harvey Dennison for killing my mom. And swimming was a healthy outlet. And I took a philosophy class. I took a death and dying class. So those are the things that really connected me more to trauma and grief, and then how to start coping because I realized I was just hiding everything, sort of like my father in a way, hiding that pain and trauma from us, which I knew wasn't healthy because I knew one day it was, that depression would seek in terms of everything.
How did you know that how your father modeled dealing with it wasn't healthy? How did you come to that understanding yourself?
I came to that after he passed away in 2018.
Okay.
Because I, wouldn't want to talk about it, wasn't grieving right. It was all inside and it was just festering more and more. And then you get those ideas of not wanting to be here. And I wanted the pain to stop. Not necessarily wanted to die, but I just wanted the pain to stop. And then my aunt passes away from cancer, 90 days later. So now I haven't really started grieving for my father, and now I have to grieve for my aunt. So and I remember the rabbi going, "Hey, it's nice to see you guys again, but this isn't a good reason to see each other, 90 days later." And in June of 2018, I had a plan. I was ready. And I had to. I put my head on my desk and I thought of I thought of my brother, and I thought of Dolly and other family members. I went, I can't send them back to the cemetery 3 times in 6 months. And I went, I can't keep doing this because I saw the pain my father went through his entire life. And I remember one year, 2012, he was in the hospital for many times. He had Parkinson's, so he had health related issues due to Parkinson's. December 19th, 2012, he sent me and my brother an email saying, even to that day, it was still too hard to talk about my mom. And that would have been their 48th wedding anniversary. So even as a kid, you want him to share stories about my mother, not realizing how tough it was.
Yeah.
So I think when you get older and you see that and you recognize it and you kind of look back at your past and then pinpoint certain things. Like he never talked about my grandmother's death as a kid. I was 8. He never really talked about my grandfather's death. I was 24. Those type of things. And you realize seeing that pain, why he couldn't really talk about that because it hurt him so much and that trauma. Um, so I realized when I wanted that pain to stop, I didn't really want to end my life. I realized I was in trouble and I had to get some help for that.
So when you said I wanted the pain to stop, so that was suicidal thoughts or
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had those
actions?
before. But this one was pretty much as close as I got. And
Well,
there was times before where I got close, but then I thought about my mother and I went, well, my mom didn't sacrifice her life so I could end mine sooner. I really think, in that split second before that drunk driver hit us, she did something to protect me. Um, like any good parent would do. And I remember being in my early 20s and living on the 15th floor of my balcony. And I don't know what was going through my life. I know I was doing stand up. I was probably broke and depressed and, poor again. And I went, oh, I could just jump off this balcony. I was a swimmer. I could just do this and swan dive. And then I remember having a dream that night. And she came to me in this dream and she said, Michael, stop worrying about me. I'm fine. And she gave me a big hug. And I woke up like face down the pillow, like my hands across my chest, like I was hugging her. So as close as I always got with suicide, it was always my mom that pulled me back. And then once my dad and my aunt passed, it was other family members and friends if I did something. And those people would be asking all those questions and whys and how come we didn't get help. And I realized how supportive my circle of friends and family were. And that's comforting to know. Depression is that warm blanket you take out of the dryer and you want to wrap yourself up and not let go. And it's so comfortable. And you want more of that. And you realize it's not always a good thing to have it and to stay in that frame of mind for a long time.
I want to thank you for being so honest and authentic about that, because I know lots of people in the space of grieving for someone else have suicidal thoughts or are what I would call, when I look back, I was so tired with that pain of living. And I don't know if you know my story, but my mother died from suicide 4.5 months later after my daughter died. So I had that experience of being on the side of being a daughter and dealing with my mother's death, or also the attempts that she had in the year prior when I was pregnant. And I think a lot of people listening can some way relate to those feelings and what to do with them. So what helped you? You said before, I knew I needed to get help.
I have a friend that I've known for a very long time who became a grief counselor, and I was having lunch with her and another friend of mine who's a comedian, and we were trying to come up with an idea for men. We called the program "Stand Up to Grief," where we're going to do some comedy, and then my friend would talk about being a widow. Another friend was going to talk about losing his son, and then losing his son as a father, and then me with my story. So we're going to do some stand up, make people laugh, then kind of dive into it. And at lunch, she goes, "You don't look like yourself. You don't look well." And so she was mentioning about counseling services, about don't forget, I'm here for you. And I went home and I went online and I did the intake form. And if it was a test, I would have aced it completely. The only one I didn't answer was, "Are you pregnant?" And that was a no. Everything else was a yes. And that's how I started. And she really, and I felt comfortable with her. And, as a therapist and counselor, it takes a long time to get comfortable with a counselor. But with her, I already have that relationship with her. And I knew as a friend, she wanted the best for me too. She hit me pretty hard with the very first day when I was going in there thinking I'm going to talk about my aunt and my father's death. Her first question was, "Hey, let's talk about your mother's death and how that impacted all your relationships." And I was stunned. I was like, well, there's a knockout punch. I don't want to talk about that. Even at age 47, I still didn't want to really talk about that in depth. But she was right. I had to. I was 47, and the very first time really diving in to my mother's death. Even though I was writing a book and I was doing these programs, sharing my story, but at the surface, it was just dealing with it at a surface level. We really had to get into it, and it was tough, but it was intense 6 months. It was a lot of homework, a lot of grieving, a lot of crying, a lot of yelling, a lot of but learning those tools on how to deal with the grief, which I never had before. Writing a letter to your loved ones, having those grief appointments on a daily basis, where I would set the timer for 10, 15 minutes and let all those emotions go out. How to cope in a healthy wise. I never abused myself. I never, drank or did all those things that, put me in harm's way, but it was more a healthy way of how to deal with grief and all those type of things. I never had that before. And being, on a weekly basis with her was good. And then at the end of those 6 months, she goes, "You look like a different person." And I feel like a different person. And it was a journey that I had to do. Now it sucks to say my father, my aunt had to pass away to get to that point, but it really did for me to find that balance.
Well, I guess you had a model there. You had your father and the way he grieved. And as we know, children model their parents or their caregivers. And so you had a model of how to deal with intense pain. And knowingly or unknowingly, part of that we always absorb. And I think it's important for those people listening to hear specifics about, and thank you for sharing the grief work or part of the grief work that you did, and for people to to get an idea. Well, what do you do in 6 months? And in your case, it was 6 months. For some people, it is a lifetime. For some people, it is bibliotherapy. They might read a book and get an insight or many insights. So you mentioned a couple of those so far. And for people who might not have an idea of grief counseling, that might be a good place to share. You said, I've learned these tools. You mentioned a letter writing. You mentioned grief appointments. What are the things, if you look back to those 6 months, what has really been helpful in dealing with the suicidal thoughts?
Yeah. And my counselor brought up a good point. When I didn't do it, I thought of the others, I thought about my loved ones more than anything else, and I couldn't do that to them. So I wasn't just thinking about myself and my pain. I thought about their pain. And I also thought about how disappointed my mom would be, or my dad would be, or my aunt, even Dolly, leaving her. She was a woman that raised us, and I couldn't do that to them. So I really had to not think about myself so much. And I still continued those type of things. I read a lot of Brene Brown's books on vulnerability and shame, and in my programs, even though I talked about the car crash and my friend John, I started to talk about depression and overcoming it and not being so scared to share. And I think once you overcome that, because I think a lot of times with depression and sadness and suicidal thoughts, we think we're the only ones going through it, and we're not. So I think there's, that phrase, strength in numbers. It's nice to go, oh, you're feeling that way too? Oh, come here, give me a hug. It's those type of things where you feel I'm not the only one. I'm not isolated and feeling that way. And that is pretty helpful. So even though I didn't go every day or every week, or every week for grief counseling, I still remembered, my training, in a way. I did go back in 2020 around the 50th anniversary of the car crash. I was turning 50, the anniversary, 50 years, I don't know what it was. And I went back, and this time we did EMDR. Mm-hmm. And my counselor's like, are you willing to do this? I'm like, I'm willing to do anything so I don't feel like this anymore.
So tell us a little bit about EMDR for people who don't know what EMDR is.
I don't remember the whole term, what it means, but it was a sensory type of thing. Sometimes people do it with the eyes. You look at the eyes and the eye rate going back and forth. But we had, she gave me sensors to hold in my hands, and they vibrated back and forth. And it allowed me to go to, your happy place. And near me, there's a park. I even though I grew up in Miami, Florida, here in Northeast Ohio, we have some amazing parks and rivers and waterfalls, and I'm a nature photographer, so I spent a lot of time out there. And visually, I went back to that happy place,
safe place,
where you feel safe. And if you had unresolved issues, you can put them in a jar and put them, in there, knowing they're still there. And with EMDR, that time around, I really focused on my friend's John, his death, and the anger I had even all those years later, because it was about how dare he do this to me. And I was so pissed at him for being the drunk driver. Mm-hmm. And I went, man, this anger, why am I holding on to this anger for so long? It's negative energy, and it's just dragging me down. And I had to, think about the good times with John and, those type of things, to let go. And, but every day, every time I went in there and to hold the sensors, it just allowed me to focus a little bit more on what I wanted to do. Brings for me, it brought my mind to that idea that I wanted to work on that appointment. And, you can have other noises in your head, but once you feel those sensors in your hands, it allows you to focus. Mm. And just the process of isolating certain things that I wanted to work on was great. So instead of, trying to, do 2 or 3 things or 4 things in an appointment, it was just one thing. Mm-hmm. And that allowed me to accomplish that with the EMDR.
So for those who are listening, I'll put the link in the show notes as well. But EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a form of psychotherapy developed in the 80s, originally to alleviate stress associated with traumatic memories and post-traumatic stress. So look that up, and I can highly recommend getting people to find out a little bit more if they're interested. It's good to hear how you use that. What do you think helped you in regards to specifically John's death, given that You mentioned John was the drunk driver, and that obviously is closely related to your own first trauma of your mother's death. What helped you there in terms of his loss as a friend, but also his feelings towards the way he died?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things was trying to focus on the type of person he was. How he died shouldn't define him as a person. And that was the biggest thing. Big John was 6'5", 300 pounds, hairier than Chewbacca and Bigfoot combined, but he was the nicest guy in the world. He would give you the shirt off his back. His laughter was amazing, just a gentle giant. And I remember all the things we did in college and the fun and just the type of person he was and the impact he had on so many people, in the good times. And to go back to the smiling thoughts about John and not being a pallbearer, and getting those phone calls and so forth, and trying to focus on the positive things. And it also helps when I give my program, I talk about being John. Like tonight, I have to do a program in front of DUI offenders. And I go, look, that would have been his first DUI. I don't want you becoming the next Big John. And so there's good that happens through his death, as weird as that sounds. But he saves lives, through his story. His mom donated his eyes as well. And I joked with her way back then. I go, great, someone else has this really bad vision. But yeah, it was just focusing on the type of person he was before that, and not thinking how him dying as a drunk driver defines him as a person. That really helped.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the programs and the presentations that you do, because I think that is really nice to hear as well, in terms of turning your trauma into a legacy and into doing something good. I think that's always inspirational.
Thank you. The program is called The Magic of Life. When I first started, I was in grad school, and I did magic as a kid. So another creative outlet to take away my trauma and grief, because it was fun. And I had a student that asked me to put together a fun program for alcohol with her sorority. So I took some magic tricks and I tried to symbolize, how it impacted alcohol and stuff, and started to share my story. So it was a fun way to kind of do it. As I got older, the magic of life means something a little bit different now, but I've been speaking for 27, 28 years to high schools and colleges, military bases. And I had a friend of mine who was a waitress at the comedy club that I started at. And now she works for a judge. So about 10, 11 years ago, she goes, hey, would you want to do your program in front of DUI offenders? And I never thought that would be an audience I would ever speak in front of, because I always thought the drunk drivers were the enemy. Anger towards Harvey Dennison is all of them, right? But the program back then was magic and my story and audience participation. So we had fun, but then we also got serious with my story. And then in 2004, when John died, I put John in there. And then I got away from the magic after 9/11. And now I just start with 5-10 minutes of stand-up comedy, having the audience laugh, and which is good, because I've done some high schools where they do a mock crash, a mock funeral, and all those emotions are so raw. I remember doing one high school where, 90 minutes later, after a mock crash and all that stuff, people are crying. And then I did that first joke and they're laughing again, and they feel human. And, we can only take so much doom and gloom for, that amount of time. So to make people laugh is awesome, because then you could take someone on your journey no matter which way you want to go. So there's comedy, there's audience participation where I bring them on stage and we wear the impairment goggles. We do like a little bit, a beanbag toss just to show how impairment affects your motor skills. And then I talk about my story and John. And it's very uplifting and inspirational, because I want people to realize, how precious your life is. I'm a guy that almost died at 8 weeks old. Due to someone making a wrong decision. So, making those right decisions in life is so important. When it comes to drunk driving, being, having a designated driver, just being smart about your actions. And then with the DUI offenders, it's been the most rewarding audience of my entire career, because here's an audience I shouldn't be in front of, really, and yet I don't go up there and yell at them or talk down to them. If anything, I inspire them to make a difference in their lives. And luckily, Dolly, with my dad and Dolly, they taught me about compassion and unconditional love, and Dolly taught me that. Coming into our life, because it wasn't about family or religion; it was just basic human need. Why she stuck around for so long, and it's the same things I give to these DUI offenders. And
So for those who are not good with abbreviation, can you
oh,
spell it
so
out?
so in America, DUI offenders is driving under the influence.
Okay, good.
So they are first-time offenders in this court program,
Okay.
and it's a diversion program, and the judges think that these are people that could be saved in a way, give them another chance. So my program is one of four, and I've been doing it for about 10 years, and it's interesting to watch the DUI offenders. The offenders sit there at first, their arms are crossed, they're unhappy, they don't want to be there, and then when you start telling humor and jokes, they go, well, this is going to be someone a little bit different. So then when I get to my story and talk about being a survivor of a drunk driving crash, it hits them a little bit harder. And some of them are crying, afterwards or, during the program. And it's not for them to feel sorry for themselves. It's almost that mentality of, if you have the chance to change, you have that ability. I'm not the one who has to see it. You have to see it in yourself.
Exactly.
And that's important. Go look, your parents are out there. What happens if something happens to you and you die or you hit someone? I had a guy that had 10 kids, and I go, what if you go to jail for killing someone or injuring someone? You got to think about others, just not yourself. And they always say they don't start off as a drunk driver for that night, but that's what happens. And when they come up afterwards and they say they've been sober for 6 months, or they buy a book, or they donate to the foundation, or they just want to give you a hug, man, there's nothing better than that. And because you win them, you see them change that 90 minutes, and that gives you purpose. And I thought about that tonight, how I'm 5 days away from the anniversary. Tonight's program will be somewhat emotional, but it's purpose, right? And I've changed as a person in the last 10 years doing it. And I don't see them all as Harvey Dennison, the person that killed my mom. I see them as mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, and people that can change. And that changes up to them. But I'll tell you, it's whether it's a high school or military, being able to share your story. And I think we all have powerful stories to share. When you share your story and you can impact someone's life, it's pretty awesome.
I think you said something really meaningful there. You said this is purpose. When you said it's 5 days to the anniversary, which I assume is the car crash.
Yes.
And we can see it as the painful, or as the purpose, or as the meaning that we make from it. And I differentiate in my first book, Grieving Parents, I differentiate between making meaning and creating meaning. And I see making meaning as what happens unconsciously all the time anyway. But then I go on to creating meaning, and that's more the conscious effort that we're taking to make something out of what we experienced and what we do with it. And another point that you mentioned was, I cannot make these people change. They have to change from within them. And I circle back to when you met with the grief counselor and your friend talking about the stand-up comedy. And when she said, you don't look like yourself. Now, not everyone might be capable to take that part of self-responsibility, but it's like someone reaching out. And then it is the other person like you in that place that you went home and filled out the questionnaire. It is how would I say, like a ping pong that happens. Someone reaches out or lends a hand, but then there is a part that needs to come from the other side. Like the integrating or the healing, the way I see it, healing as a process as opposed to a state, needs to be willingly taken. It's a path that is there for people, but it's up to them to go.
Oh, I totally agree. I think getting help for trauma and grief is no different than someone goes, hey, I want to lose 10 pounds. You reach that point when, okay, I can't keep doing this. I need to change, or I want to quit smoking. I think it's the same thing. You get so tired of living, for me anyway, I got so tired of living, sadness and darkness and depression, and I wanted to live, and I needed that help. We had swim coaches growing up, so in a way, it was no different than having a swim coach. It was my counselor was my swim coach. Sometimes I needed a kickboard thrown at my head. And sometimes I needed that tough love and that push, as you said. But I had to be the one to change. And it wasn't about medication, whereas medication could be part of it, but it wasn't going to solve my issues. And I realized I was the problem, and I had to fix me more than anything else. And I had to put the work into it, and I was dedicated to putting the work into it. And it's tough to do, but all that hard work, you kind of give yourself a happy life. Not always happy, but when you feel like for me, when I feel my chemical balance change and those levels, I go back to what I learned in counseling. Go sit by the river, go for a bike ride, go work out, go take pictures. I didn't have those tools before. And I would sit and fester and just, have those thoughts of suicide and go, oh, I could do that, tomorrow or today. And now I go, there's a thought, and they go, I'm not going to give in to those thoughts. I'm going to go the other way.
Yeah, working those tools that you've learned along the way. So to round this up, if you look back over your life with all the trials and tribulations that you've endured and mastered, what would you say has your journey taught you?
Well, it's a very good question. Years ago, I always wanted to be the son my mother would be proud of. And then once my father died, then it was you'll be a son my parents would be proud of. And I think that's my biggest theme is just don't be a disappointment to them. Making mistakes, and you're going to make mistakes, but I think any parent wants to be proud of their kids. So that's probably my mantra: is be a son my parents would be proud of, and that inspires me on a daily basis to live a good life, a healthy life, and make a difference in this world. Try to make this world a little bit different than how I came into it.
So how do you think your parents would be proud of in relation to how you dealt with the earliest trauma? What would that look like? That's an interesting question.
My dad, on the last few birthday cards or conversations, he would say he was proud of me. Now you're going to get me to cry. And I still have those cards. And for taking that trauma and grief and turning it into good, where I could have done nothing my entire life. I could have sat in a bottle my entire life and go, what was me? And this is my life. And, I don't use it as a crutch. I don't use it for people to feel sorry for me. But I think my mother would be proud too. Her legacy lives on through me. Her legacy lives on through my brother, who teaches kids how to swim and to survive. So we're both doing something that's saving lives. So I think she would have been very proud of us in terms of the people we have become. Probably more than my brother. I mean, he's not here, so we're not going to talk about him. But but yeah, I think when you think of others and trying to make their lives better, I think that's what it's really all about.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to round this up. And as you know, I'm always going to finish my podcast with the rapid fire questions. Shall we do that?
Okay.
Grieving and trauma means?
Wow. Survival. I mean, the trauma is the catalyst, but the grieving is showing your love for the ones you lost. And both are hard, but I think with help, you can get through all of it in a loving way.
And healing means?
Peace, internal peace, peace within yourself, in your soul. I think that's healing. And it's an ongoing process, but feeling that peacefulness, it's every day that you work on it. It doesn't stop.
I was cheering on there when you said it's a process, because that's just absolutely the distinction that I want to make for people, where some people have an avoidance to healing because they think it should be somehow finished. And I don't believe in that. What I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
That I'm stronger than I thought. I mean, even at my lowest of my lows, to overcome so much, that's where I learned that I'm a strong individual.
And one thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma?
you can't escape from it. I mean, it's part of life, and it's going to hit everyone in a different way. And knowing that there's help to get is probably the biggest thing. Get help. You can't always do it alone, and nor should you. But just realize, don't be afraid to ask for help. Asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness, and it's there. And reach out to anyone you can, because we all go through it. But there's people to help you navigate through it.
And one specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss?
I'm going to say having Dolly in my life, because you take that horrible situation, and here's a woman that came into our life. I wouldn't be the person I am today without her. So on the days you kind of go, I wish my mom was, it's hard, because someone goes, well, do you go back in the past and change your life? But yet I had her to raise us. But she's been a blessing in our life. So you take the horrible situation, but here's something that's beautiful that came from it, and this woman that changed our lives.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time and sharing about yourself and your program. For anyone listening, all the links are in the show notes, and you can find all the good things that Michael is doing with his programs and with his books. And I just want to thank you for being here and sharing the male perspective.
Thank you. I love being on. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.